Chapter 18. Goodbye for now. But the next morning the car was loaded and the cottage key slid under the mat, and the only person there to say goodbye was Harry, in a black Harry's Tomatoes shirt. "Black because I'm sorry you're leaving," he said. "I'll miss the excitement." "And you haven't heard any news about Geoffrey?" said Skye. "You mean since he ran away and his mother found him hiding with you?" Harry shook his head. "I really am going to miss the excitement." "Harry, tell him we left presents on the front porch," said Jane. "I'll do that." Harry handed a large paper bag to Mr. Penderwick. "Tomatoes." "Thanks, Harry. All right, girls, it's time. Pile in." "A little longer, Daddy," said Jane. "Maybe he'll still come." "If he hasn't by now, I don't think he will. I'm sorry, honey, but we need to start on our way." Skye and Jane stuffed Hound into the back with the suitcases and boxes. Then everyone slid into their seats, taking the same spots they'd had arriving 3 weeks earlier. They looked as miserable as it's possible to look without crying, and probably some of them were. "I didn't say goodbye to Yaz and Carla," said Batty. "They'll be disappointed." "You can send them a postcard when we get home," said Rosalind. "And Churchy, let's send her one too." "Good idea." "And Geoffrey?" "Oh," said Jane. She was definitely one of the criers. "If we haven't heard from Geoffrey in a few days, I'll call and make sure I talk with Churchy. I promise," said Mr. Penderwick. Harry was pulling out in his tomato truck. "Say goodbye to Harry." "Goodbye, Harry. Thank you for all the tomatoes." The sisters waved out the car windows while Hound barked unhappily in the back. "Here we go." Mr. Penderwick started the engine and headed down the driveway. 4 heads turned to watch the yellow cottage disappear into the trees. "Goodbye, white bedroom," said Skye. "Goodbye, secret passage in the closet," said Batty. "Goodbye, dearest Geoffrey and Churchy and summer and magic and adventure and all that's wonderful in life," said Jane. "Goodbye, Cagney's Fimbriata rosebush," thought Rosalind. And goodbye, Cagney. She turned around and unfolded the map, and a brand new uneaten one. There was the route home, marked in red. She'd done that the night before, but the red line was oddly blurry. Annoyed, Rosalind dashed the tears out of her eyes. "At the end of the driveway, we turn right onto Stafford Street," she told herself resolutely. "Then we go left on—" "Whoops!" said Mr. Penderwick, stepping on the brakes. He'd left his glasses on the kitchen counter and had to run back for them, which meant that Skye and Jane had the chance to check the tunnel for Geoffrey one last time, and in a flash they were out of the car and racing off. Rosalind turned around and looked at Batty, very small and woebegone, in the back seat. "Are you all right?" she asked. "No." "Endings are sad, aren't they?" "Yes." And way in the back, Hound whimpered in agreement. Rosalind was trying not to whimper herself, for now that it was too late. All of a sudden, she knew she'd made a mistake. "Oh, I'm so silly," she thought. "I'm only 12 years old. Well, 12 and a half, and Cagney's much too grown up to be my boyfriend. But he was my friend, and I hid from him the last time he came to see me. And he didn't come to say goodbye today. And if he remembers me at all, he'll remember me as a little jerk who fell into the pond and ruined his date, and I'll never see him again ever for the rest of my life, if only, hey, Rosalind." And there he was, at her window, in his red socks cap, friendly and cheerful, just the same as always. Rosalind's if-onlys floated away, and she was left with that now familiar hit-by-a-truck feeling. And although it was a nice feeling this time, her heart was beating so quickly and her breath was so shallow that she couldn't say anything, but could only open the door and stumble out of the car. Cagney caught and steadied her before she fell down altogether. "Still having trouble with your head?" he asked. "No, yes, let me see." She pushed aside the hair and let him gravely inspect her bruise while she tried to calm her nerves. "Doesn't look like there'll be permanent damage," he said, "unless you had a concussion, and that's why you're babbling." "I'm not babbling." She said it very slowly and precisely. "Good," he said. He looked into the car. "You've lost most of your family." "Daddy's getting his glasses from the cottage, and Skye and Jane are looking for Geoffrey. They'll all be back soon." Now Rosalind noticed that Cagney was holding a pet carrier. Glad for any excuse to avoid his gaze, she bent down and peered in at 2 funny bundles of fur squished side by side. "You brought the rabbits," she said. "They're why I'm late," said Cagney. First Carla hid behind the refrigerator, then Yaz wouldn't let me get him for the longest time. But I thought Batty might like to see them again before she went home. Rosalind's heart, whose beating had slowed down a bit, now swelled to twice its normal size with gratitude. She called into the car, "Batty, the bunnies are here to say goodbye." "I brought you something too." Cagney reached behind him and picked up a large pot. "It's a Fimbriata rose. I figured you deserved one of your own, after helping me with mine." "Oh, Cagney." Rosalind took the pot and buried her nose in a white bloom. A present. She didn't have a present for him. She should have given him some of those brownies after all. Would she ever understand boys in her whole entire life? And what should she say now? Then, thank heavens, Batty was out of the car and throwing herself at the pet carrier, and Rosalind was able to figure out her next lines. "Thank you so much for the Fimbriata. I'll take care of it forever. And thank you for bringing Yaz and Carla. Batty desperately wanted to say goodbye to them. Just as I desperately wanted to say goodbye to you." It was on Rosalind's face, but she didn't say it. Well, really, it was Yaz's idea. Cagney took a carrot out of his pocket and let Batty feed it to the rabbits. Over his shoulder, Rosalind could see her father returning, and now she heard Skye and Jane's voices. They were headed back, too. "Take courage, Rosie," she thought. "This is your last chance to act mature. And please say goodbye to Kathleen, and thank her for me." "Who?" What did he mean, who? You know, the girl who helped me out of the pond." "Oh, Kathleen, that didn't work out. She wasn't easy to talk to. Not like you. Hold on to that skill, Rosie, for when you're old enough to care about boys, they'll appreciate it." Suddenly he was leaning over her and planting a light kiss on the top of Rosalind's head. Her eyes fluttered, and she thought, finally, something wonderful to tell Anna, until she opened her eyes again and saw that he was kissing Batty before strolling away towards Skye and Jane. Probably to kiss them, too. I'll be lucky if he doesn't kiss Daddy and Hound before he's done. Well, at least I'm the one with the rose bush. "Why do you look so funny?" said Batty. "I don't." "Yes, you do. Like you're going to laugh and cry at the same time." Rosalind carefully stowed her Fimbriata on the floor of the car, where she'd be able to watch over it during the ride to Cameron. "I'm just glad to be going home, that's all." A few minutes later, all the Penderwicks were back in the car, once more waving goodbye. "Goodbye, Cagney," said Mr. Penderwick. "Thanks for all the plant talks." "Goodbye, Yaz and Carla," said Batty. "I love you." "Goodbye, Jeffrey. Darn it all, where are you even? Cagney doesn't have a clue," said Skye. "Goodbye, Sanity, because not knowing is driving me crazy," said Jane. Rosalind waved and smiled one last time to Cagney. "Farewell," then smoothed out the map. "Stafford Street. Where's Stafford Street?" she muttered, then realized she was holding the silly thing upside down. With much rustling, she flipped it and, "Daddy, stop!" Skye shouted from the back seat, "It's Churchy!" And there was Churchy, jogging toward them through the trees. She burst out into the open, waving her arms, just as Mr. Penderwick once more stepped hard on the brakes. The whole family was out of the car in an instant, running to meet her. "Churchy! Churchy!" Jane and Batty threw themselves at her while Skye danced impatiently in circles. "Excuse me. Jeffrey! What's happened to Jeffrey?" Churchy was too winded for anything but huffing and panting until everyone thought they'd explode with not knowing. Finally, she managed, "Thank goodness I caught you. Oh, my beautiful girls, I'm going to miss you." "But Churchy, Jeffrey," said Skye. "I know, dear. Hold on. I'll tell you myself in a jiffy. He cut through the hedge to the cottage in case you hadn't left, and sent me this way in case you had. And oh, here he comes. I can hear him shouting." Now they could hear him too, yelling, "Stop!" and "Wait! Please!" And then they could see him. What joy! Rounding the curve, his legs moving so fast they were like a blur. Like lightning, the four girls were off and running toward him, and a moment later Jeffrey had disappeared under a pile of Penderwicks. When he came up for air, he was laughing and talking as fast as he could. "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late, but Mother just made the phone call to the school this morning, and they said yes, and—" "Hold on!" Skye waved her arms in front of his face. "Start again," said Rosalind. He smiled around at them. "Everything's okay now." "Jeffrey!" That was Jane, frantic with curiosity. He paused, and now he was teasing them. At last he said, "I don't ever have to go to Pensy." The cheering was so loud and long that, as Churchy swore later, the Arundel birds fled and didn't come back until the next spring. When the Penderwicks' throats finally gave out, Jeffrey started over at the beginning. After we went back to the house yesterday, Dexter wanted me to go to my room, but Mother said she wanted to talk. So we talked, and then she cried, and we talked, and she cried, and that went on forever. Then Dexter went home, and Mother and I talked some more. And you were right, Rosalind. I was finally able to make her understand about Pensy, and that was great. And she even said I never had to go to West Point if I didn't want to. And then we started talking about Dexter. Jeffrey's smile faded a little. She's still marrying him? Said Skye. He nodded. It could be worse, I guess. Yeah, she could be marrying a serial killer. Or a werewolf, said Jane. Or a... Batty couldn't think of anything worse than a werewolf. Anyway, I told Mother if she's going to marry him, I really would prefer to go to that boarding school in Boston. You know, the one I told you about? And this morning she called them, and they'll take me in September as long as it turns out I'm not a complete moron, and Mother promised she'd drive me to Boston herself. Just me and her, without Dexter. And wait, I haven't told you the best part. Jeffrey held up his palm for high fives all around. She said I'm allowed to take a music class at the conservatory, just one class for now, but it's a beginning, right? Oh, yes, yes, they all shouted, and if any Arendelle birds had stayed behind after the last outburst, they surely left now. Jane and Batty couldn't stop hopping up and down, and Skye kept tossing both her and Jeffrey's camouflage hats into the air, and Rosalind went so far as to kiss Jeffrey on the cheek, and there having been so much kissing already that day. Then Mr. Penderwick, after getting the good news in a calmer fashion from Churchy, came over and shook Jeffrey's hand and slapped him on the back, and then Churchy started to cry, and then Jane started to cry, and then Batty, and when even Skye started to cry, it really was time to go home. So for the third time, the Penderwicks loaded themselves into the car, but this time with light hearts and consciences and glad relief that comes with happy endings. Skye rolled down her window, and Jeffrey leaned in. Churchy stood behind him, her hand affectionately on his shoulder. We're going to miss you, Jeffrey, said Jane. We'll visit him in Boston, said Rosalind. And I'll visit you in Cameron, said Jeffrey. Just remember, if you don't, I'll kill you, said Skye. I'll remember, said Jeffrey. Goodbye, Hound. Stay out of trouble. Hound wagged his tail cheerfully. Just thinking about trouble made him happy. Okay, everybody, let's go, said Mr. Penderwick. Goodbye, Jeffrey. Congratulations again, and the best of luck. Goodbye, goodbye, said everyone. And off they went again, down the long driveway. Well, off they went for about 20 yards anyway, because by then Batty was pleading for her father to stop the car just one last time. She had something to do. What is it, Batty? Said Rosalind. Something very important. Please stop, Daddy. It won't take long. Mr. Penderwick stopped, and Jane let Batty out her side. Everyone hung out their windows to watch Batty run back toward the cottage, calling to Jeffrey. He walked forward to meet her. What's she up to? Said Skye. She's telling him something, said Jane. He looks surprised, said Rosalind. Oh, do you see what she's doing? Said Jane. I can't believe this. She's taking off her wings and giving them to Jeffrey, said Skye. He's putting them on, said Jane. My wise little Batty, said Mr. Penderwick. With that, there was nothing left to say. They all sat in silence while Batty trotted back, climbed in over Jane, and settled in her seat. Now we can go, said Batty. But Batty, your wings, said Rosalind. I told Jeffrey he could borrow them. What did he say? Said Skye. He said thank you. Nothing else? Yes, he said, goodbye for now. That's nice, said Jane. I like that. Hound, say goodbye for now, said Batty. Woof, said Hound. Then they were gone. The end. So I have to tell you something. I had never read this book before. It was recommended by our sweet librarian, Mrs. D'Ambrosio, and I just started in on it without even previewing it, and it was awesome. And just a minute ago, when Batty gave her wings to Jeffrey, I got little goosebumps all over, and I felt a little tear in my eye. That was so sweet. I loved that book. I loved the adventures of these sisters, and I loved this new friend that they found, and I loved that Jeffrey was kind of on his own in the house, like not very no siblings or people to play with that he liked, and that he found a home with these sisters, and that they all just loved each other, and just seems like an awesome 3-week vacation in kind of a wonderland, secret garden type thing. Oh, that scene when they're the garden party, when they're having the garden competition, and they're playing soccer and they get carried away and they forgot there's a big competition going on, and just the when she's on the ground, I think it was Sky on the ground, and she looks over and she sees some high heels, and then she sees some other high heels, and it doesn't really dawn on her for a couple more seconds that, oh my gosh, they're in the garden when the competition's going on. That was so funny, and I could just feel her, like, I'm sure her heart just seized, because they were told over and over again to stay out of the way of the competition, and they were trying so hard to keep away from Mrs. Tifton, and then they were right in the middle of all of it. Gosh, that was just a great story. I love the idea of a rope ladder at night to go climb up to a friend's room in secret in the summertime. It was kind of magical. And I loved reading it aloud. And I think in a couple years, maybe when you're in 3rd grade, to go back and read this yourself, or 4th grade. I think you'll love it, and I think you'll love it in different ways. I think it's so great for right now for a read aloud, but promise me you'll revisit it on your own, read it on your own, and let me know how that goes, because I bet that you will love it again, but in a different way, and that's pretty cool. I love revisiting great books because I get something new out of them every time I read them. Thank you for sharing the book with me.